The night I married into the Hale family, I thought I was stepping into forever. My dress shimmered under the lights, my heart certain I had found my place. But then, as the champagne glasses clinked, my mother-in-law leaned close, her lips brushing my ear. "You'll ruin our legacy." That sentence pierced deeper than any blade. I smiled, but inside, something broke. They thought I was fragile, naive, easy to dismiss. They never realized silence can be the sharpest weapon, and while they laughed at my weakness, I was already building something stronger. The first days of marriage felt like a stage play. The Hale mansion glowed with chandeliers, servants moving like shadows, and the air heavy with a kind of pride that wasn't mine to share. I had stepped into wealth, but also into expectation. At the wedding reception, Margaret Hale, my new mother-in-law, pressed a velvet box into my hands. Inside lay a necklace of emeralds, gleaming with centuries of ownership. She announced, "This piece has been passed down through generations. Now it belongs to you." The room applauded, champagne glasses lifted high, and I smiled, but inside I felt the weight of chains disguised as jewels. That night, when the music faded and guests drifted away, I caught her whispering to Richard Jr. near the stairwell. Her tone was sharp, not celebratory. "She'll ruin our legacy." The words sliced through the silk of my wedding gown, leaving me cold beneath the lace. Richard gave no protest, no defense. He simply nodded. I stood there in silence, frozen in my own house, wondering if I had just married a family or a prison. Days became weeks, and the mask of kindness slipped further from Margaret's face. At breakfast, she corrected the way I poured coffee, sneering that a Hale woman knows precision. At dinners, she shifted conversations toward legacy, reputation, duty, always circling back to me, reminding me what I wasn't. Even Richard, once tender, began echoing her standards. He was quick to remind me of expectations whenever I faltered, as if reading from a script written long before I arrived. One afternoon, curiosity pulled me into an unguarded moment. Richard had left his phone unattended in the library. A notification buzzed, and I glanced without intention until I saw the group chat, Hale Family Circle. My name appeared, coded in laughter and venom. The gold digger. She won't last a year. A mistake will correct. Each message was a needle. My chest tightened, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of pain. I locked the phone and left it as I had found it, but something had shifted. My silence was no longer weakness. It was preparation. Margaret's control grew bolder. She dictated my wardrobe, insisting I wear family-approved colors for public appearances. She handed me schedules, social events, press interviews, with lines already written for me. "Do not improvise," she warned. A single wrong word could embarrass us. I smiled and nodded, the obedient bride, but in my mind I was memorizing every rule, every leash, every attempt to script my life. Then came the discovery that turned obedience into strategy. While tidying Richard's study, I stumbled upon a thick leather binder hidden beneath old newspapers. Its title, embossed in gold, chilled me. The rulebook. Inside, page after page, dictated the treatment of daughters-in-law, restrictions, financial limits, behavioral guidelines. It was not tradition. It was control codified, and scrawled notes in the margins bore handwriting I recognized, Richard's. My husband had contributed to this manual. He had signed his loyalty not to me, but to the system that caged me. The realization burned, but it also clarified. I was not just fighting Margaret. I was stepping into a web generations deep, where silence was demanded and individuality erased. That night, I sat on the edge of our bed while Richard slept, the emerald necklace heavy against my throat. I whispered to myself, "If they want a ghost, I will give them one, but it won't be mine." The next morning, I began quietly assembling my defense. While Margaret believed she had broken me, I ordered small, discreet devices online, tiny cameras, hidden microphones. I installed them in corners of the mansion, beneath the chandelier, behind the grand piano, even inside the frame of a family portrait. Each click of the hidden lens felt like a promise. I moved silently like a guest in my own home, smiling at their taunts, nodding at their dismissals. They thought I was docile, powerless. They thought their whispers were safe, their corruption hidden. They didn't realize every sneer, every scheme, every betrayal was now mine to keep. And so began my game. Played in silence, armed with patience and fueled by a growing fire they had sparked themselves. The illusion of paradise had shattered, but beneath its ruins I was building my own empire of truth. I learned quickly that pretending to be weak was more dangerous than appearing strong. Each morning, I let Margaret dictate my schedule, choosing my outfits and rehearsing lines for interviews. I nodded, smiled, and repeated her words back to her, as though I were her puppet. Richard seemed relieved by my obedience, convinced I had surrendered to the Hale way of life, but what they saw as submission was nothing more than camouflage. At luncheons, I allowed Margaret to cut me off mid-sentence, to laugh at my suggestions, to dismiss my opinions as though they were childish musings. Guests chuckled politely, reinforcing her dominance. I lowered my eyes, played the role of the fragile bride, and tucked away every insult for later. It was in these moments of calculated silence that she revealed the most. One evening, after a particularly condescending dinner where she had boasted of the Hale fortune's untouchable legacy, she leaned closer to a friend and whispered about a hidden account in the Cayman Islands. She spoke with the arrogance of someone who believed no one was listening, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "A little cushion," she smirked. "No one will ever trace it." My smile didn't falter, but my pulse quickened. Every slip of her tongue was a weapon she was handing to me. Late at night, in the privacy of my study, I began experimenting with the technology I had quietly collected. Small devices, software hidden under layers of encryption, tools that could record and replicate voices with terrifying accuracy. I recorded Margaret during one of her tirades, her sharp voice cutting into me about how I would never measure up. Then, with a few strokes of code, I duplicated her voice. The playback was uncanny. She was scolding herself in her own tone. It was more than just evidence. It was power. I now had the ability to expose her words or manufacture scenarios that would unravel her carefully curated image. Still, I kept my expression soft, my manner docile. When she demanded I host a charity tea, I stumbled purposefully with my speech, drawing sympathetic laughter that only deepened her sense of superiority. "Poor thing," she said with a grin. "She's trying." I met her gaze with a gentle smile, while behind my eyes I measured the cracks widening in her armor. Meanwhile, my secret life outside the mansion began to take root. I had discovered a fledgling startup in the world of artificial intelligence. Brilliant engineers with revolutionary ideas, but no funding. They reminded me of myself, underestimated, overlooked, dismissed by larger players. I invested quietly, moving funds she believed were hers to control into accounts only I could access. With every dollar, I planted a seed beyond her reach. I didn't work alone. Slowly, carefully, I gathered allies. A former employee who had been cast aside after decades of loyalty. A cousin estranged because he had challenged Margaret's decisions. Even a former friend of Richard's sister, discarded after daring to stand her ground. We were bound by the same wound, the Hale family's ruthless hunger for control. Together, we began to form an alliance hidden in plain sight. As the startup grew, so did my quiet confidence. I followed progress updates in secret, software milestones, successful tests, breakthroughs that hinted at disruption. Margaret remained oblivious, too busy boasting at dinners about the unshakable Hale dynasty. She laughed when I pretended not to understand discussions of finance, patting my hand like a child's. "Leave those matters to us," she said. I lowered my gaze, but inside I savored the irony. One night, after everyone had retired, I sat alone in the glow of my laptop. The dashboard of the startup's progress flickered before me, numbers climbing with each passing week. The valuation had quintupled, investors circling like hawks, though my name was hidden deep in the shadows. I leaned back in my chair, the emerald necklace glinting faintly in the monitor's light, and let a small smile break across my lips. They believed I was a liability, a delicate ornament draped on Richard's arm. What they didn't see was the arsenal I had been building in silence. Every insult, every attempt to break me had become the stone and mortar of something stronger. While they caged me with their rules, I had already found the key, and soon I would unlock doors they never even knew existed. The Hale mansion thrived on appearances. Smiles were polished, conversations rehearsed, even laughter timed like an orchestra. Beneath the shine, however, cracks had begun to stretch. I decided it was time to widen them. My silence had carried me this far, but silence alone wouldn't dismantle a dynasty built on deceit. I needed them to destroy each other, and I knew exactly how to begin. One morning, over coffee served in bone china, I let my words slip carelessly, as though by accident. "I've been thinking," I said softly to Richard and his sister Victoria, "perhaps I should move some of the Hale funds into safer accounts. Just a precaution." The air thickened instantly. Richard's hand froze halfway to his cup. Victoria's eyes narrowed, and within moments they were exchanging glances heavy with suspicion. I smiled, sipping my coffee, pretending not to notice. By nightfall, Margaret knew. She stormed into my room, fury flashing in her eyes. "What did you say about moving money?" she demanded. I widened my eyes, feigning confusion. "Just an idea," I whispered, voice trembling on cue. "I thought it might help protect the family." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Don't overstep, Emily. You're not capable of protecting anything." She left with a slam of the door, but I knew the seed had already been planted. The following days, I caught fragments of hurried whispers in corridors. Phone calls ended the moment I entered a room. Victoria became distant, studying me with suspicion, while Richard's touches grew colder, more mechanical. Their fear of betrayal was louder than any words I could speak, and then the trap was set. Late one evening, Richard asked me to sign a document he claimed was routine. His tone was gentle, his eyes rehearsed with false affection, but the edges of the paper betrayed him. I recognized the legal jargon, the hidden clauses. It was designed to strip me of any financial rights within the family business. I let my hand hover above the pen, heart thudding as though in hesitation, before lowering it deliberately. "I'll read it later," I said sweetly. His jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. They had underestimated me again. What they didn't know was that I had already prepared. Weeks earlier, I had created digital files, a mix of authentic recordings and carefully crafted forgeries. In one, Margaret's voice scolded Victoria for being careless with money, hinting at hidden accounts. In another, Richard's voice betrayed frustration at his mother's control, suggesting he was ready to turn on her. Each file was a spark waiting to ignite. I allowed one file to fall into the wrong hands. Victoria received it first, tucked anonymously into her email. Hearing her mother's voice, sharp and scornful, accusing her of weakness, she grew pale and silent at dinner. A day later, Richard discovered a different file slipped into his messages, one that painted him as Margaret's scapegoat. Their eyes no longer trusted each other, every smile edged with doubt. Margaret, sensing the shift but unable to pinpoint its source, grew paranoid, her commands harsher, her grip tighter. The harmony of their empire was unraveling stitch by stitch, and I stood quietly in the center, smiling like the obedient bride they believed me to be. But then came the discovery that shook me more than I expected. While searching Richard's study late at night, I uncovered a drawer locked with a code I had already guessed. Inside lay contracts, some official, some hidden, their language soaked in illegality. One document bore his signature alongside Margaret's, a deal that skirted international law, funneling funds through shadow accounts. If exposed, it wouldn't just tarnish the Hale name, it would obliterate the company. I stared at the papers under the dim desk lamp, the silence of the mansion pressing down on me. Here was the weapon that could end it all, the evidence that would topple their empire. My fingers trembled with the weight of decision. To release this would be to burn everything to the ground, including Richard, the man I had once loved, the man who now stood against me. For a long moment, I considered it. The thought of Margaret's empire collapsing under the truth filled me with dark satisfaction. But then I closed the drawer, slid the key back into place, and exhaled slowly. Not yet. Destruction was too easy. Let them erode themselves. My silence had always been sharper than fire. That night, I opened my digital journal, the screen casting a cold glow across my face. I typed only one sentence, the promise that kept my heart steady as the storm brewed around me. Let them burn. For months, I let them believe they had cornered me. I played the helpless wife, the silent figure at their side, nodding as Margaret paraded her control and Richard signed papers in her shadow. In private, however, I was no longer simply documenting their cruelty. I was building an escape hatch, one that would transform into a weapon. When the moment came, it was quiet, almost anticlimactic. A press release slipped into the digital bloodstream on a Tuesday morning. A new AI startup, Aurea, announced its arrival with a sleek prototype, an algorithm capable of detecting financial irregularities in real time. Anonymous leadership, anonymous backers. Yet within hours, the story surged. Headlines marveled at the innovation, at how such a small company had dared to challenge giants. And behind every line of code, every polished word was me. Margaret's reaction was swift and venomous. She stormed into the breakfast room, waving her tablet like a weapon. "Do you see this?" she snapped at Richard and Victoria. "A fraud company trying to undermine us. They dare to compete with Hale Enterprises." I bit into a piece of toast, eyes downcast, heart racing with a triumph I dared not show. She had no idea the threat was already inside her walls. Within days, analysts began comparing Aurea to Hale Enterprises. To Margaret's horror, Aurea's software not only matched the Hale systems, it exposed vulnerabilities. Whispers spread that Aurea's tools could trace hidden accounts, irregular transfers, the very lifeblood of Margaret's concealed empire. She doubled her PR efforts, dismissing Aurea as a fad. But every denial only fueled curiosity, and curiosity became suspicion. The first calls from journalists arrived. Questions about Hale finances, about transparency, about accountability. Margaret brushed them aside with her usual icy poise, but I saw the tremor in her hands. For the first time, she was no longer untouchable. And then came the betrayal she could never have predicted. The CFO, her most loyal guardian, the man who had executed her orders without hesitation for decades, requested a meeting. Days later, he resigned. Weeks later, whispers confirmed what I already knew. He had joined Aurea, my Aurea, the mansion filled with shouting. Margaret slammed doors. Richard accused Victoria of treachery. Victoria spat accusations back. Their empire was bleeding from within, and they couldn't see the knife in my hands. Meanwhile, Aurea's reputation soared. Reporters began calling the unknown leader the silent builder, a phrase that made me pause each time I read it. They didn't know my name, but they felt my presence. My silence had become my brand. Employees began to defect. Engineers, analysts, managers who had endured Margaret's tyranny for years quietly packed their desks and crossed over to Aurea. Each departure was a crack in the Hale dynasty, widening until the walls trembled. Margaret tried to stop them with threats and lawsuits, but every move backfired, making Aurea look stronger, more righteous. The breaking point came with the collapse of a major contract. Hale Enterprises had long held dominance over a government deal, one Margaret flaunted at every dinner table. But Oria's technology, adopted by a rival bidder, exposed discrepancies in Hale's numbers. The contract was lost overnight. Share prices plummeted. Margaret's voice, once booming with authority, now cracked with desperation. I watched it unfold from the quiet safety of my study, laptop screen glowing with numbers climbing steadily upward. Oria's valuation soared as Hale's crumbled. Margaret still hadn't connected the dots, still believed I was nothing more than the wife at her table, smiling politely while her world collapsed. I leaned back, hands resting lightly on the emerald necklace that once felt like a shackle. Now, it was nothing but costume jewelry, a relic of a dynasty already burning. On my screen, Oria's dashboard flickered. The value of my shares had multiplied again, the line climbing higher, unstoppable. I smiled, small and deliberate, the kind of smile Margaret would dismiss as meek. If only she knew. If only she could see the fire she herself had sparked, the ashes that were already forming around her. Their legacy was crumbling, and from its ruins mine was rising. Victory has a flavor both sweet and bitter. On the surface, I had everything. Oria was no longer an upstart, but a titan, hailed as the future of financial technology. The silent builder had become a legend, and though the world didn't yet know it was me, I carried that power with a steady hand. Yet in the mansion, my marriage was dissolving piece by piece, like glass left in the rain. Richard Jr. grew colder with each passing week. The more Oria rose, the more Hale Enterprises crumbled, and his loyalty to his mother deepened. Arguments flared over dinner, small at first, then searing. "You don't support this family," he hissed one night. "You've embarrassed us." I looked at him across the table, remembering the vows we had once shared, the dreams whispered in quieter times. But his eyes no longer held love, only duty, drilled into him since birth. He had chosen his side, and it was not mine. Margaret, though shaken, took satisfaction in this fracture. She played Richard like a violin, her voice dripping with pity. "She was never one of us," she told him when she thought I couldn't hear. "But you, my son, you are Hale through and through." Each word was a wedge driven deeper between us. The bed we once shared became a cold expanse of silence. My victory outside these walls felt hollow when I lay awake at night, the weight of absence pressing against me. Still, I did not falter. Strength does not come from being unbroken, but from knowing how to rebuild. I poured myself into Oria, into its growth, into ensuring it could not be crushed by the remnants of Hale Enterprises. And then, the unexpected arrived. A message encrypted and discreet from a global tech giant whose name alone carried power. They wanted Oria, not as a partner, but as an acquisition. The offer was staggering, a figure that could buy back the Hale dynasty 10 times over. I sat in silence as the numbers glowed on my screen. To sell would mean safety, recognition, unimaginable wealth. It would also mean surrendering the weapon I had forged, the tool that had allowed me to turn their empire into rubble. The offer lingered in my mind like temptation itself, whispering of freedom purchased at a cost. But power has its own price, and I was already paying. It was in the middle of this storm that I uncovered the truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. While sifting through old files and family records, searching for traces of Margaret's failures, I stumbled across patterns too intricate to belong to her. Deals signed decades ago, manipulations buried so deep they had survived generations. The threads all led to one man, Richard Hale Sr., the patriarch, the founder, the silent architect of everything the Hales called legacy. Margaret, I realized, was not the mastermind but the apprentice. She had been carrying out his design, guarding his empire, keeping his secrets. The cruelty, the control, the obsession with power, it all traced back to him. He was the true puppet master, pulling strings long after most believed he had stepped aside. When the realization sank in, a chill spread through me. This was not just a battle against Margaret's arrogance or Richard's weakness. It was a war against the very foundation of the Hale dynasty, a structure built on deceit and preserved by a man who understood control better than anyone. He had let me think I was fighting the queen, when all along the king had been waiting in the shadows. The next family gathering confirmed my fears. He arrived without fanfare, carried in by the quiet deference of everyone in the room. Richard Sr., silver-haired, sharp-eyed, his presence more commanding than any voice. Margaret, who ruled over me with cruelty, bowed her head in his presence. Even Richard Jr. straightened, his voice trembling when he greeted his grandfather. When his eyes landed on me, it felt as though he had known my every move. A small smile curved his lips, one that promised knowledge and threat in equal measure. "You've done well," he murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. "Too well." In that instant, I understood. My war had only just begun. Margaret had been the storm at the surface, but he was the tide beneath, pulling everything into his grasp. If I was to protect myself, if I was to protect the future from being shackled by his legacy, I would have to face him. That night, I returned to my study, closed the door, and opened my journal once again. My hands shook as I typed, but the words were steady. The queen was never the enemy. It was always the king. When Richard Sr. revealed himself, I felt the walls of the Hale dynasty close in around me. For a time, I feared I had come too far, only to be crushed by the architect of everything I despised. He had built this empire with the precision of a general and the ruthlessness of a tyrant. Margaret had been his vessel, Richard Jr. his pawn. Against him, I was nothing more than an intruder. And yet, it was precisely because I stood outside their web that I had the power to unravel it. I spent nights gathering every fragment of evidence I had collected: recordings, forged conversations, real contracts, false whispers, all of it. I connected the dots into a map of manipulation spanning decades: offshore accounts, bribed officials, silenced whistleblowers. It was not just a family empire. It was a machine designed to protect itself at any cost. The truth was heavy, almost unbearable, but it was also liberating. I had been underestimated from the start. Now they would see the cost of that mistake. The moment came with precision. I released the files into the world not through a dramatic press conference, but through quiet, undeniable channels. Journalists received encrypted packets. Regulators discovered sudden leaks. Employees woke to evidence that confirmed what they had long suspected. The house of cards shook, not with a single gust, but with a storm that tore through every level at once. As the news spread, the Hales scrambled. Margaret vanished from public view, her name dragged through headlines that once praised her elegance. Richard Jr. stood before cameras, stammering weak denials, his voice cracking under the weight of exposure. And Richard Sr., the man who believed himself untouchable, found the world he had crafted collapsing not with fire but with transparency. But here lay the twist. I did not burn their legacy to ash. Instead, I reshaped it. Through Aurea, I announced the transformation of the very idea they had clung to for generations. Legacy, I told the world, should not be a cage but a platform. It belongs not to the few who hoard it, but to the many who can build upon it. I opened Aurea's technology, creating a foundation where oversight was no longer a privilege of the powerful, but a right shared by all. For the first time, financial truth was not hidden, but accessible. The world erupted. Headlines called me a revolutionary, a disruptor, a savior. They named me the woman who changed the rules of the game. For every betrayal I had endured, the applause of strangers became my justice. And as I stood in the glare of that recognition, I felt the weight of their chains finally lift from my shoulders. The Hale family dissolved in silence. Margaret disappeared into exile, her empire stripped away. Richard Jr. came to me once, eyes hollow, apology trembling on his lips. "I didn't see," he whispered. "I should have chosen you." But it was too late. The man I had once loved was nothing more than a shadow of the boy I thought I married. I let him walk away without anger, without forgiveness. Some wounds do not heal, but they no longer control you. In the aftermath, offers flooded my desk. Corporations dangled obscene sums to buy Aurea. Each figure was larger than the last, promises of comfort and safety I could never exhaust. And yet I declined them all. I had not fought to build another empire of secrecy. I had fought to break the cycle. Instead, I announced the creation of the Carter Foundation, a global initiative using Aurea's resources to educate and empower young women in finance. "Let this," I said in my first public address, "be the true legacy. Not wealth hidden in vaults, but knowledge shared in classrooms. Not silence imposed by fear, but silence transformed into power." On the morning the foundation launched, I stood alone on the balcony of my new office, the sun rising over the city. The emerald necklace lay in a drawer, forgotten, its weight no longer mine to bear. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with gold. For the first time, I was not looking back at the Hale mansion, nor at the scars it left. I was looking forward into a horizon I had built with my own hands. The world believed my story was one of revenge, but I knew better. It was a story of transformation. I had entered their world as a bride, underestimated and silenced. I emerged not as their victim, but as my own architect, rewriting history in the quiet strength they mistook for weakness. And as the sunlight broke fully across the skyline, I whispered to myself the truth they could never erase. I was no longer the woman they thought would ruin their legacy. I was the woman who created a new one.